Hello, this is a quick video on using the constraint layout in Android Studio. So I've created a form over here that you can see. It's just a very simple form that says sign me up, and I put a few different plain text as well as a number type of input field down here that my intention is to collect some data from the user, and then I have a submit button. So very simple, but not unusual to have several widgets on the layout at one time, and I want them to display, in this particular case, centered and, vertically. So depending on how you want to organize it, of course, you're going to move these items around in the position that you would like to have them. The thing that's probably, at least for me, the trickiest to understand about the constraint layout is that when I would move the widgets around on the preview screen here, when I would run my program, it didn't necessarily look like how I had, laid out my individual widgets. And that was a new thing that Google came up with a few years ago, the constraint layout. Prior to that was the relative layout, and the relative layout was a little easier to use because you would just drag and drop items where you would want them. Here you can see when I would hit run, what this preview actually renders as in the emulator. So it's not looking so good here. So let's take a look at what we can do. As I said, I did a drag and drop without doing anything else here. I didn't make any efforts to set up my constraint layout, and what I mean by that is every widget that is on the layout, each one of these pieces has to be constrained. And let me begin by just giving an example here. I'm going to click on the first one, which is a no edit field, a text view that says sign me up. So I want sign me up to basically be centered in the screen, and I would like it to be not right at the very top, maybe down so many units, maybe 20 from the top. So let's see how we can do this. If I'm looking at my preview here, I can touch this top circle, hold down uh, my mouse button, and drag up. Oops, didn't quite take there. There we go. And what that did was it added a constraint. I constrained my widget to the top of the screen. Now, if you look over here to the far right under the attributes window, there's actually something called a layout. And this shows us that at this point I have a constraint. Now the reason why I know that, let me clean this up, I think that's left over from earlier. The reason why I know that is there is not a plus sign, and it actually says 0, and basically that's the margin from the very top. So if I want to, let's say, come down about 24, I can do that, or I could even type in my own custom value, and notice if I do that, it added a margin of 40, and now I have the sign me up constrained to the top of the screen. You always want to constrain your widgets at least in one vertical and one horizontal direction. So if you want to left align everything, you would basically constrain things from the top and the side, the left side. If you want to center things though, like I'd like to do, and I'd like it to be centered regardless of screen size, so if somebody looks at this on a tablet, it is still centered, then what I would do is I would constrain both the left and the right sides. So again, I'm going to click and hold my mouse, drag, and that added a constraint to the right. You can see over here that constraint was added, and I can do the same to the left to add that constraint. So now you can see all three. Just a couple things about it. If you make a mistake, you can, drag and drop and move things around here. But over here, I was actually looking for this circle. If you hover over any one of these circles, a little X appears. So if I hover over this right constraint, I can X out, and it removes that right constraint. I'm going to go ahead and add it back, though. Oops. There we go. Now we have our constraint back. Now I didn't actually add any margins here. That's okay. What it will do is it will figure out how much space, and because 0 and 0 are equal to each other, it will half that space and center it correctly. I could put a value here right, a value here on the left, but I would want to make sure that they're equal to each other if I intend for this widget to appear centered. So that's how you can constrain. So again, you can basically click around in this layout window to edit your margins, to get rid of constraints or to add constraints. And you can also, as I said, actually add the constraints over here. So I tend to go back and forth. I use this preview window. I also use the layout window. Now, when you move on to let's say we have a linear design like this, where we want our items stacked one on top of the other. When you do your second widget down, instead of constraining to the top of the screen, I do recommend clicking, holding, and constraining to the item above it. Let me try that one more time. I don't think it took. There we go. So I'm going to constrain to the item above it, and to make this spacing nice, let me look at, that was 40, okay. I'm going to select that widget, come over here in the constraint widget menu, and I'm going to add 40, and that'll bump that down a margin of 40. So it constrained it to the sign me up. What that means is it's like an anchor. It's anchoring itself 40 below the sign me up. And I can add constraints in the same way that I did before by clicking and holding. I'm going to show you a different way over here on the layout window. To add the left constraint, I can click the plus sign and it adds it. The one thing about that though is just beware, here it added a margin of 202. I'm going to put that back at 0 and let it divide up that evenly between the left and the right hand side when this thing runs. So let's go ahead and do the others as well. Notice it wasn't sure if I wanted to constrain to the top or the bottom, so I'm going to say the bottom. See, as you get used to this, you get a little more comfortable. It goes faster. It is not as intuitive to me as the relative layout that they used to use. Took a little bit to get used to it, but the idea behind it is that well, there's a couple ideas behind it. They've switched to a constraint layout because it flattened the nesting hierarchy that relative layout created, and apparently it took longer to render, and it took more resources. So the constraint layout is more efficient. And the other reason is that the constraint layout is supposed to be the most flexible in terms of adapting to various devices and screen sizes. So, in other words, I'm centering these regardless of the screen size. Notice I'm not really even specifying any sizes other than I am bumping things down 40. For each widget is a space of 40 from the one above it. But the other sizes, I'm going to let the rendering engine handle the centering of those. So you can see that looks much better. Things are clearer now because items are constrained to each other. So it takes a little nuance, it takes a little getting used to, but those are the basics of getting around using a constraint layout.